Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. My guest today is Simon Cassin, and we have a really thought-provoking, in-depth, mind-altering, very exciting and interesting discussion all about ethics. We were hoping to get through a much longer discussion, but actually we ended up kind of going into lots and lots of detail on these couple of key points around what is harm and what is a right. And this is all in the context of, is a zero harm approach to safety ethical or not? Simon wrote a PhD dissertation about this topic. And so he kind of guides us through this discussion. I try to contribute where I can. But it certainly left me feeling very excited about a different way of thinking about things. It's led me to question lots of things in my mind, and I'm looking forward to getting Simon back on in the new year to finish off this discussion. And then I've got lots of other things in mind I want to talk to him about as well. So I really enjoyed this. I'm sure you will too. You'll get a lot from it. It'll make you think. You might need to pause it and stop and have a bit of reflection time at points as well. So do give this one some good attention, and I hope you enjoy it. Cheers.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Thanks for joining me today on the podcast, Simon.
Thank you very much for having me, as they say, Christian. I'm really looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, me too. So we had a pre-chat, and there's a lot to cover today. So it may be that we end up splitting this into a couple of episodes, but we'll try and sort of keep it refined into one episode if we can. So the background to this, Simon, is that you've got a really interesting background and done lots of things. We won't go into all the details of that, but you've done a dissertation all about, is zero harm an approach that is ethically justifiable within the world of safety? So what I thought we would do is kind of unpack that. There's 4 sections to it, and we can kind of talk it through. I'll sort of play the village idiot role, and kind of, you can ask me questions, and I'll play up to that. But no, in all seriousness, we can chat it through, and I'll give you my sort of perspective as well. But does that sound like good fun to you?
That sounds brilliant. Yeah. Let's see where it goes. That'd be really good. Thank you very much. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, no, good stuff. And you mentioned you want to give just a bit of context as to the dissertation or the discussion today.
Yeah. So I've done a bit on philosophy. I'd sort of done a bit of study on that, and then my starting point is that I believe and can argue that almost everything we do in the workplace, we can be traced back to some form of ethical or value judgment.
Yeah.
And because of that, I think that includes our approaches to health and safety.
Right.
When we think about, why would we apply this control measure as opposed to that control measure, is in some way, consciously or actually, it should in some way consider the ethical implications or the ethical foundations of those decisions. I think one of the things that is anecdotal, I have no evidence. I'm not so sure we do that consistently.
Mm-hmm. I'm
not so sure we do. And I wonder whether, as a profession, and I'm very proud of being a safety person, I give it my best shot like everyone else does, I think that we can elevate the status of our profession by actively considering the ethical implications of our choices, of our suggestions, or the advice we give and whatnot. I think we can definitely do that.
Yeah.
When I thought about the what to do in the masters and for my dissertation. The question itself isn't really the bit. It might seem contradictory, but the question itself is simply a placeholder for further discussion,
Yeah.
for a wider discussion of health and safety in its role, and whether professional and all that lot, and responsibilities of business. So whilst the title includes the term zero harm, it's not really about zero harm. It's saying we're considering things from a wider perspective than that, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think, one of the things that's a challenge, I suppose, is that you have to balance this kind of messaging that's easy to understand and can get through to people and captivate their attention. And that's where, safety, safety is a topic that everyone can kind of buy into, because however you define safety, and we're going to get into some definitions, aren't we? It's something that sounds nice and feels nice. And so, yeah, we can all kind of buy into that. But then that level down of, well, what does that actually mean? What are the implications of that? How do we define this? How do we define that? There's a lot more nuance to it, isn't there? And I suppose that's kind of what we're getting into today.
It is, yeah. I mean, I think that we need to communicate and to assert moral standards or ethical positions from a meta-ethical position and a normative position. No one should ever be harmed in the workplace is a normative statement grounded in meta-ethics. And I think that we need to have some kind of understanding of the differences between the two. I mean, I've got a question for you. Is business ethics the same as professional ethics? And is professional ethics the same as everyday ethics? Is it all just one thing? Or is it...
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? I would say that there has to be a difference slightly, because um, if you're acting as a professional, so let's say you're I don't know, a doctor or an accountant or something like that, then you may have signed up to certain kind of code of a charter or something like that, where you're kind of agreeing that you're going to act in a certain way, and sort of ethically, therefore, you have to act in that way, even if maybe you don't feel as if that is the right way, and you might not act in the same way in your personal capacity. So I suppose there's one maybe line there. And then I would say there's another line around, businesses have an obligation to seek to make a profit and to act in the interest of their shareholders. They have a legal obligation to do that, don't they? So again, there's, you might act differently in a business setting than you might in a personal setting in the same kind of circumstance. But that would be my instinctive response to that.
And I agree with you. Not everybody agrees. Not everybody agrees in the world of ethics. Some people. So it could be called different things, but a common way that I see it, that what I've read and whatnot and studied, said it's this difference between what's called simple ethics and business ethics or professional ethics. They say, well, actually, having those terms is just disingenuous. You just don't need them. There is only ethics. Now, the problem is if we see the world purely and view it and say things should, i.e. normative statements, that's wrong, things should be like this. If we see the world through that simple ethics perspective, it creates unrealistic expectations and it creates challenges which we just cannot overcome. A perfect example would be, okay, so if you look at the relationship between a barrister or a lawyer or a solicitor or whatnot, people in those professions, if you look at their relationship, their primary duty is to who? Is to their client.
Yeah.
So their client divulges some information and the solicitor goes to court and feels that information could have a negative impact on their client, even though it's important information, they have responsibilities to actually not divulge some things, not everything, but some things. If you don't see a doctor, and the doctor might talk, and they might say, "Oh yeah, you've got this condition or something." Well, having that condition could affect other people, but the doctor has no duty to say, "Oh, by the way, Charlie's got this or got that." So hold on, so there are differences, aren't they?
I
And
would say so. Yeah, yeah.
the way that I sort of see that is looking at what we might call role related ethics. Okay, and in there we'll also put business. Okay, so the ethical guidelines for a doctor or a lawyer or a safety professional or somebody, like say accountant or whatnot. They relate to what they do, and it's not the same as we would accept what I call relationship ethics, which are outside. So say me and you are next door neighbours and you lend me your lawnmower and all that kind of stuff. There's an element of right or wrong in relationships that are not work related. One of the first things we've got to do is to figure out our stance on that. What I'm mindful of is I'm not happy with. I don't see my position as telling everyone else what they should think. I genuinely don't do that. I'm not. That's not what I want to do. I think I would like people to think for themselves. So whilst I may have an opinion on whether business ethics and health and safety and professional ethics is something separate than what we might call simple ethics, what I think we need in our profession is the ability to consider that and to discuss it. It doesn't really matter what I think. I'd quite like to be involved in the discussion and say why I think X and not Y.
Yeah.
We as a profession have got to be mature enough to go, well, actually, no, we think this. And if you can't get that question right, we can never really move on to important questions, because which version of ethics are we using? And if everything's the same, well, one of the ways to consider this is this. So let's say we've got a vacancy and we're looking for somebody to work at Ouch, my company. Yeah, okay. So we want someone to do it. Okay, and when people, we put the advertisement on the website or whatever, and all that business, and people send in their applications and things. Do we have a legal responsibility to consider the merits of all the applicants fairly, and and say, well, we've got this person with these qualifications and this person with that. Do we have a legal responsibility to be fair in that respect? Give everyone a best shot, a reasonable shot at getting the job.
Don't think we do we? I think we probably have obligations about not discriminating, but I'm not sure if we have an obligation to be fair.
Well, I think I'm going to disagree with you there. I think
Okay.
we can't reject people. I think maybe we're actually not disagreeing actually on reflection. So, for example, a person's gender, their age,
Yeah.
their colour, etc., sexual orientation and whatnot. We
Yeah.
can't say this person can't have the job because of factors such as those, yeah?
Yeah.
And we should try and be objective as far as we can, and look at the evidence in front of us, and base a decision on the employment of person to some degree based on, like you say, we're not going to discriminate people. So if we take that approach outside of work, and we said, okay, well, I'm having a birthday party, and who should I invite? Do I have to adopt the same approach inviting people to my birthday party as I do to employing people?
No, not legally.
No. I don't know. No. And so I don't know if that analogy works, but it shows that there is some kind of difference we can argue about what that difference is, and you mentioned legal requirements, and that is obviously is important. But if we just forget legal for a moment, I think we would say that it's unfair to discriminate in the workplace. Forget whether it's legally acceptable or it's laws. Forget that. We'd say, well, hold on, that's not fair. You've got to give people a fair shot. But I don't think we would say that we have to have all relationships where it's immoral to discriminate. So by looking at it from that perspective, if nothing else, at least it at least raises the possibility that some may want to discuss further, and that'd be great. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
Saying, well, there does appear to be something different, and if there's something different in that example, is this something different in other examples, i.e., our roles and responsibilities? And I've thought about it a lot. It doesn't mean I'm right, by the way. I know that. And it just seems plausible to me that it's not the same. So the way that I might view something in a non-work situation as being, I don't think that's right, blinking out, that's not great. I might do that. I wouldn't necessarily, that if that same thing was related to a workplace or a business or whatnot, I wouldn't necessarily see it in the same way.
Yeah, it could be degrees. You might still disagree with it, but you might not be as vehemently opposed to it because there's a context around whether it might be financing or anything really that could play into the reasoning of the situation being that way.
So if our starting point is if we can tentatively accept that there is a difference between business and professional activities than there is in our home life and whatever, then if we agree with that, then our discussions about what may or may not be ethical within a business context, we can now narrow it down to in a way that other than that, it's just too big, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, just to confirm, we're not saying that there aren't overlaps. We're not saying that there are not some things that we could describe as being ethical or unethical out of the business, the workplace, and that. We're not saying that there are things that everything exists separately. There are definitely things that cross over, but there are some things that are specific to one aspect of life and another aspect of life, in my opinion.
No, let's rock and roll with that, Simon. That's a good background, and I think it's useful to lay that foundation, isn't it? Because otherwise, as you say, some of the things we're going to be talking about are just so big that you can't then kind of grapple with them and try to condense them into something manageable for everybody. So we're going to work through 4 steps, aren't we?
We are. Just one more fundamental bit that I just like.
Okay. Yeah.
This is quite important. There is often discussion about the difference between ethics and morals. Okay, it's irrelevant, and that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of ethicists. Okay. Yeah, well, do you know what? I'll just use the terms interchangeably. It doesn't really matter, because what matters is the thing we're talking about, not whether it falls under a bracket of morals or whether it falls under a bracket of ethics. And I don't want us to get bogged down in that, because So if we could just sort of, I don't know, start off with that as well, that'd be really cool.
Yeah. No, good stuff. Okay, cool. So we're gonna talk about 4 things. What is harm? What is a right? Is zero harm an industry duty of care, a fiduciary duty of care? Sorry, is it a corporate social responsibility? And then, does the safety profession have a duty to adopt zero harm? So they're the 4 kind of headings that we're going to run through under this banner of, is zero harm ethically justifiable? So let's start with the first then. What is harm? And I guess you're going to ask me to define it first, are you?
Yeah, you read my mind. Go for it. See what you got.
So I would say and again, I think there are different definitions of harm that I think we could layer into this. So I think there is physical harm. So that could vary from, a paper cut or a bruise or a graze at one end through to a fatality at the other end, or a serious life-altering brain injury or some other injury that's kind of towards that end of the scale. There's emotional harm. So, people could be negatively affected um, by something happening to them, which affects their mental health and their mental well-being. Um, there's financial harm. So, we might, if somebody something happens to somebody and they're forced to change their career or end their career, and that could have a financial impact on them, or if they can't work for any reason, that could have a financial impact on them. Um, can't think of any more off the top of my head, but those are the three buckets of harm that I suppose you could start with. What am I missing?
Well, I don't know if you're missing. Right. So an interesting question is does all, so if we just look at the physical side of it for now, would we say that a paper cut there or a bruise on my hands, a little bruise there, like,
Yeah.
bash me hand, is that harm?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? I mean, it's harm in that you're altering the state of something that otherwise wouldn't have been altered. So therefore you've affected it, and I suppose you could define that as harm. But equally, is it, if you look at harm in another way, is that really harming them? Is that harmful? Probably not. Um, so yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it, as to how you define it, and do you have to narrow it down into harm means a certain severity of physical harm? I don't know.
Okay. So one of the first things I wanted to consider is this notion of harm. It's
Hmm.
fundamental to our concepts of how we might approach health and safety. I mean,
Yeah.
people may have different definitions, but a common definition is of a hazard is anything with the potential to cause harm. So philosophers go, well, okay, brilliant. What does harm mean? Yeah, that's what they do. They ask questions like that.
Hmm.
And I think that what we've got is we've got an almost universal understanding of harm in our industry, which actually is harmful to our ability to be professional.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's say then, and I've never read an argument. There may be arguments out there, and now obviously we're using the sort of the placeholder of zero harm.
Yeah.
We're using that as a placeholder. I've never heard of or read an argument which actually, first of all, tries to define what we mean by harm.
Hmm.
I'm not saying they don't exist, by the way. I've only read a fraction of what's been said about these
Of course.
things.
Yeah. Hmm.
So I'm not saying that. Okay. There are some explanations of zero harm which actually differentiate and it might seem like I'm contradicting myself, but I'm not actually, because they don't necessarily give you a definition of it and explain why that definition is what it is. But there are some notions of approaches to zero harm where it talks about severe injuries and worse.
Yeah.
Okay. So right. So this idea of whether something is harm is fundamental, I would argue, to our very concepts of health and safety.
Hmm.
So if we say a bruise on my hand, there, a little bruise like that, if we say that's harm, okay, that would mean that an industry that has to consider harm and the likelihood of harm, okay, must also need to spend time and effort considering whether I'm going to get a bruise on my thumb, on my knuckle there. Okay. Now, the notion of harm and what it is, I believe it's a problem for us because what we do is we comprehend harm from what I call safety harm perspective. Okay. So I'll give you an example. So near where I work, there's some construction work going on, and I think there's been a bit of an incident with parking on one of the sites. And so from a safety perspective, I've not done any work with these people, but from a safety perspective, they've said, right, there's been an incident regarding vehicles on site, so nobody's allowed to park on site. Okay.
Okay.
So in an attempt to prevent serious harm, because vehicles can cause, I don't know if there's been a terrible injury or anything, but
Yeah.
in an attempt to prevent serious harm, because we know vehicles can cause terrible outcomes. We know that if they bash into people, what they've done is they've gone, right, we'll prevent safety harm here. But what they've now done is put literally tens, maybe 50 vehicles out in the local community. And we've now got businesses where customers can't go because the plasterers and the electricians are blocking. There's double yellow lines, so children crossing the roads can't see where they're going. And so what we've done is, in an attempt to do safety harm, we've not considered, or they have considered and thought, well, it's acceptable. They've not considered the harm or the harm caused. Okay. Our view of harm is partly what you said. I agree. I agree with what you said there, but it's actually inadequate. Because when we view harm through the safety harm lens, there are lots of harms that become invisible. Because the only harms that we consider are things where could cause, fatal accidents, major injuries, major ill health, and time off work. Okay. Now, if they're the ones that we record and we think that they're important, okay. Well, what about the bruise on the hand? Because we've got a moral assertion that it's wrong for anyone to be harmed in the workplace. So where does that fit in? That's one question to consider. Another question to consider is it okay? Is it morally acceptable or ethically appropriate in the pursuit of preventing a bruise on the hand? And we'll just use that as an example. I understand it might seem a bit facile, but anyway, but if we see that as harm, is it okay to prevent that? But in order to prevent that, what we've now done is we're now interfering with the local community's business ability to carry out its business functions. Are we now adding issues? I mean, I see some of these people with massive sort of tools and tool bags and whatnot struggling down the road. So, okay, so I'm going to prevent harm for this, but I'm going to definitely add a load of manual handling harm in there.
Yeah.
So how have we thought about that? That's even from a safety perspective. So there was a conversation the other day on social media, and it was talking about harm. And there's something, I'm going to read it out actually, because this is actually quite important. And it's not that, it's something, our notion of harm. There's a document which a lot of people may have read over the years, or maybe they haven't. And this is the HSE's description of harm.
Okay.
They start off and they say harm includes ill health and injury, damage to property, plant, products, or the environment, production losses, or increased liabilities. Okay. Just even that definition is interesting, isn't it? So if we're talking about preventing harm, it appears that production losses and increased liabilities fall under that bracket if we accept that they,
So then we're into the world of operational efficiency and productivity, and
we are, aren't we? So I don't know how commonly we consider those issues. But what they also do is they expand this view and they say, okay, they also argue that any consideration of risk should encompass more than physical harm, take into account other factors such as ethical, economic, and social considerations. Now that's quite interesting. I mean, that's over 20 years old, that. Okay. I think we missed that bit. I think our profession didn't acknowledge that bit and didn't go with it. Okay. And so the point that I'm trying to say here is that when we grade all harm and we classify all harm as being unethical or immoral, whichever way you want to do it. When we do that, we create a we create a moral imperative which is unrealistic. It's not only,
Unachievable.
it's not only unachievable, it's also unrealistic from a normative perspective. So unachievable is about practically, can
Yeah.
we achieve it or whatever? And there's been lots of chats about that, and people have put arguments in one way and arguments in another way. And it was important to me not to go down that road, not to go down the road of whether zero harm is actually possible to do it. That wasn't the aim of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to just think about ethics and the morality of it. So the point that I think I'm trying to get across here is that we can hold a view that says we can morally justify that we think it's that no one should ever be harmed in the workplace. We can hold that view, but realize that view is not necessarily going to guide what we do. So let's come back to this idea of harm. So harm has been considered by various philosophers along the way, and generally what they say that harm involves severe detrimental effects to a person's well-being. They're not just focusing on safety, they're focusing on what does harm mean. So it's something that has a significant effect. So and they use this term well-being. A well-being would sit there, and a subcategory of well-being would be physical, not injured yourself, and mental health and stuff. But also in there is things like autonomy. Okay, so if I severely impact your ability to be autonomous, according to that version, then what I'm doing there is I'm actually harming you.
Mm.
You mentioned financial harm before. Well, okay, so in pursuit of reduction or prevention of safety harm, is it possible that we might cause you financial harm? Right, everybody, we're not happy. Someone might slip on that. So I know you're a subcontractor and you're on a day rate, but you'll have to come back in 2 weeks' time. Hold on a minute.
Yeah.
I had a job here for 2 weeks, and now what do I do now?
Mm.
Yeah. So is it possible that we are looking at health and safety and the way we might approach it? Is it possible that there are occasions when, in pursuit of preventing all minor injuries, is it true that we might inflict other harm, not safety harm, but what I call general harm on our stakeholders? Is that true?
Mm.
And if it is true, that's interesting then, isn't it?
Mm.
That now becomes interesting. Let's look at it just from a safety perspective. What legally do we have to do? Well, we have to prevent and put in appropriate, control measures and manage and whatnot to prevent serious harm, don't we?
Yeah.
Not all harm, serious.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always say this to people, your obligation isn't to prevent every accident, it's to take reasonable and practicable steps to mitigate risk, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah. Oh, okay. So the point being is we have a narrative of no one should ever be harmed in the workplace, which includes the bruise on the elbow and, the worst possible outcome. Okay. We have these versions, these notions of harm, but they both fall under a general moral or ethical attitude. Because we're saying no one should ever be harmed at work. Now, if we then think of harm as being severe physical, terrible broken bones and all that stuff, or illnesses and whatnot, and worse, well, what we've done now is we're recognizing that moral judgments are gradable, aren't we? So if someone went to work and something awful happened, you could quite understandably say, well, that lot, they were blinking unethical in asking Charlie to work that way. That's not right. Yeah, forget what the law says. It's just not right. But if someone says, "Oh yeah, I got a bruise on my hand," I'm not so sure we'd respond in the same way. So one of
Mm.
the first things I tried to do in this chapter is to acknowledge the gradability of harm and to extend a notion of harm beyond what I call safety harm.
Yeah.
Because my argument is this: if we only view harm as being all things and only related to people who could be physically or psychologically impacted by our manufacturing or whatever it is we do, okay, we failed in two areas. The first area is the scope of harm is too big, needs to be narrowed. And then the second thing we need to understand is our focus on, like I said, safety harm is too narrow because it fails to consider general harm to other stakeholders. It fails to consider that, resulting in what I know as a term called amoral, where we basically have not considered the morality of our actions. So just to confirm then, I believe we should narrow it down, and it's not just me believing this. This is, I think people out there are doing safety consultancy and working for businesses and stuff, and I would imagine they're focusing on the big holes and the heavy machinery and whatever. They're focusing on that stuff, aren't they? Yeah. And I think we recognize common industry practices that we look to consider fatalities, major injuries, major illnesses, and time off work. They're the ones we record. So we do recognize that they're the most important things. So why do we, over here, do we have this notion of zero harm and no one should ever be harmed in the workplace? They are incompatible.
Yeah, it's a bit incongruent, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And these are things that we're going to have to figure out. What is our approach?
Mm.
Because if we can't figure it out, we can never have a meaningful conversation about whether something is or isn't moral or ethical. You just can't.
Mm. Yeah.
Because we're not even using the same words.
Mm.
So another interesting thing to think about here is that if we see harm from this different perspective, and we have a look at if we can accept to some degree that when we're thinking about risk, we've got to think about the ethical and social, economic and social considerations of our approaches to risk management. That really does seem to bang up against this idea that no one should ever be harmed in the workplace. It really does.
Mm.
Are we in a position to tell society what should or shouldn't be moral? Is that our place?
No, I wouldn't say so.
Well, I don't think it is either. It
No.
doesn't mean that we shouldn't lobby for, if
Mm.
the laws are inappropriate, or, we're not helping people who work in whatever industries, and, we haven't managed these chemicals and whatnot. I'm not saying that we just, oh, well, we'll just keep quiet. I'm not saying
No.
that. But the argument, in my opinion, should be based on severe harm, and it shouldn't be based on telling society what it should or shouldn't value. And the
Yeah,
reason
so
is,
of avoiding being the safety police, in other words.
well, we don't like it when people see us that way.
Yeah.
But then we put things on social media and say, oh, look at that Muppet. Look what they did. Oh, blinking heck. I've never seen a doctor put somebody's injury on the internet, on social media, and say, well, this fella, he shouldn't have been this and he shouldn't have been that. And they don't do that. Okay. Why do we feel that we have to tell the world that this person's a bit of a Muppet? Why do we have to do that? I don't understand. Yeah. But we've got ourselves in this cycle of thinking we are somehow morally superior. And this is a general statement, not everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm not saying that's everybody, because that is absurd and it would be incorrect and everything like that. But it is a common narrative, isn't it?
Yeah.
Am I? What do you think? I'm asking you now. Is that a common
Yeah.
narrative?
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, so what happens then if we then say, well, okay, safety harm is going to involve severe detrimental effects in relation to safety harm. And then we say, well, actually, harm also includes these things as well: autonomy, respect, coercion. Coercion is a common thing in the safety industry. Dishonesty, deception. These are things, yeah. Plagiarism, theft. These are not unusual things, you know.
No.
And these are things that are being carried out by safety professionals. Yeah. Okay, so if we start to look at those kind of things, and from a general harm perspective, we've now got a different discussion.
Yeah, because is it possible for none of those things to ever happen? In other words, to meet the broad goal of zero harm? No, no.
So from a zero harm perspective, it would seem implausible that when we open it, well, first of all, it would seem overly narrow to just think about broken bones and physical illnesses and psychological distress related to work. That's overly narrow, okay, from a zero harm perspective. But if we broaden it out, and we still have this notion of all harm, if our harm is all detrimental effects of any degree are somehow morally unjustifiable or not morally unacceptable, we just create a whole mess of impossibility. Really, you know, that's not very. It wasn't very academic. That was it. It just becomes. It's too onerous. It's just like, you know, we're not omnipotent, you know, omnipotent. We don't know all things. We don't have unlimited power. You know,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
don't have that. Okay. So my view is, and I think the thing there is we need to be considering general harm, not just safety harm, if we want to be a professional.
Yeah.
Because when we look at what it means to be a professional, some people will be members of professional bodies, some won't. But we'll take IOSH, for example. IOSH is a chartered organisation. And I don't know if you're aware, I don't know if you're part of that, Christian, but I know many people are. As a chartered, the Privy Council say that our primary duty is to who? Do you know? Are you
No, it'd be to the monarch, wouldn't
to the? Well, no, it's not to the monarch.
it? No,
It is to society.
to society.
So if it's to society and not to John and Julie on the workshop in the workshop, okay, is it possible that we may think of ways of approaching and managing risk that might help Charlie and Julie, but actually be detrimental to society? I think,
Yeah.
you know, there's a lot of people out there struggling with their bills now. If we say, well, actually, we're gonna focus on no one ever being harmed in the workplace, and that means it takes us, and this is just a notional number, it takes us 20% longer. I'm not arguing that that's a true number, but 20% longer or more resources or whatnot to manufacture our things that we sell. Well, it's reasonable to then imagine that those things would be more expensive, which is reasonable to understand how that would affect people in, you know, in going about buying their food and whatever it is people buy.
Or you could say we want to be safer from a physical harm perspective, so we're going to get rid of these 10 roles that are physical labor roles, and we're going to replace them by some kind of robotics. And that means that we can close this plant down, and those 10 people lose their jobs, and their families are poorer, and it closes down local businesses because there's not people supporting the economy, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
So these are, you know, these are examples of things that we need to think bigger. You know, we need to be able to consider these things in a different way. than we currently do, being that myopic view, that narrow view of making sure Charlie, the off chance that Charlie may or may not get a bruise on his arm, okay? Or this also is related as well. If we say, well, okay, well, the risk of serious harm must be managed to a point where actually we're unable to fulfill our business purpose. Well, that's a problem. I mean, I don't know if you know, I used to be in the fire service. If you say, well, no one should ever be harmed in the workplace, well, you better stop the fire service straight away.
Yeah.
Can't do that job. What about the police? They go and do all manner of things where, people are, where they're harmed and stuff, trying to keep us safe or whatever, all that stuff they do. Okay, what about mining? What about, and you could go on and on.
Yeah.
Basically, we couldn't do anything, could we? Which is,
No.
I mean, that's it's a reductio argument, so we probably won't focus on that too much. But yeah. So the next bit that I was interested in was looking at the idea of rights.
Yes. So what is a right? Yeah.
Yeah. So just
Section 2.
Sorry, Christian, you say.
No, so it's part 2, section 2 of this discussion. Yeah.
So first of all, part 1 rejected the notion of zero harm because it's overly, it's a bruise on the elbow and the worst possible outcome. All of that quantified as harm in many versions of zero harm. And I also rejected it, like I say, because it didn't consider general harm. So that's rejected. So I rejected it from that perspective. So now what I've got to do is, because this is, I didn't set out to reject zero harm. I set out to consider it. And whilst I'm along this journey, I have to make some of this up because there are no arguments.
Yeah.
I have to go, well, okay, why would we believe that it's that it's wrong to always harm somebody? And so there are people out there who I think mistakenly, but some vocal people who say that health and safety approaches are purely deontological. Do you know what that means, Christian?
No.
So, okay. So it's rooted in, we can trace it out. I mean, there are many variations, and this is a way oversimplistic explanation of it, okay? But it's sometimes called Kantian. So basically it works like this. So Kant said, he talked about a thing called a categorical imperative. Now, a categorical imperative is something which is, we are duty bound to behave according to this imperative, irrespective of its outcomes. So it uses the example of not telling lies, of being honest. Kant uses this as an example, and he says that we should never tell lies, irrespective of whether not telling lies gives us good outcomes. And the reason why we should do that with categorical imperatives is because of what's called the status account. So, and a lot of moral theories use this. So it's the idea that there is something about humans, okay, that creates them having a moral status that is worthy of protection, that is worthy of respect. Yeah, because we're humans, all humans are into being human. There's something there about it. Yeah, okay. Well, it's not right to harm humans. So the idea is that when we say no one should ever be harmed in the workplace, okay, there's not an obvious reason why. It's what's called a non-inferential statement. I think that's wrong. Why? Well, because I do. That's not an argument.
Yeah.
That's a statement. Okay. So I had a look at possible arguments to say why no one should ever be harmed in the workplace. And a possible argument is this. Humans should never be used, for example, purely as a means to an end, but should be considered as an end in and of themselves. Okay, and that's a recent thing I've seen on the LinkedIn where somebody's made that argument. They made it incorrectly, but that's okay. So, when I say incorrectly, what I mean is they've misrepresented what Kant said. That's
right.
what. Yeah. Okay. So that's why status theory. Humans are important. Because of that, we must have this rule that no one's ever harmed in the workplace. Do you see how I've joined those two together?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. But if you have a categorical imperative, there's no wiggle room. It's always that way. Okay. Even if it means we're going to go bust or something else, But the problem that you get once you say that is you create what's called the paradox of deontology. So there's a categorical imperative. No one should ever be harmed in the workplace, yeah? But over here, we've got people should have a right to spend their money in any way that they like. Now, what do we do with categorical imperatives when they do that? They bang against each other. Well, they can't bang against each other because they shouldn't have been considered as categorical imperatives. Because what Kant said was, don't make one of these imperatives unless you've considered its implications and anything else that you've said is we should or we shouldn't do. You've got to take a step back and think about it. Yeah, you can't just have loads of categorical imperatives all around,
which conflict with one another, and they can't coexist.
So it creates a paradox.
Yeah.
So now what we've got is then, well, we go. So then what I did was I thought, well, okay, all right, yeah, fair enough. Let's try and save the argument, okay? Because that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to reject it. I'm trying to make it as good as it can be and then consider that argument. So then we could say, well, actually, it's not a categorical imperative, an ethical maxim. It's a hypothetical imperative, okay? Which is like, it's like number two, a second version, yeah? Okay. But the problem with a hypothetical I'll explain what it means. So a hypothetical imperative is something that's based on what I believe is right.
So like in an ideal world, no one should be harmed at work.
Right, okay. But what that means is there has to be some kind of argument as why what I believe should take precedence to what other people should believe. And so it doesn't have the same moral standing as categorical imperatives. Now, I've oversimplified that, and that's fine. And I'm not saying everybody who does a managing safely course needs to understand Kant, because that's absurd. Okay, I am not saying that. But what I do think is we should be able to think about the implications of our moral statements, especially people who are senior in an industry, who can help the rest of us figure it out, I think they should be guiding us, and when we question them, they should be able to say why. I don't think everybody needs to know. I mean, no, you never. That's a different profession. Okay, so the problem we've now got is if we actually go, well, we don't really think a hypothetical or a categorical imperative are acceptable. Let's get rid of that, and now we're going to look at. Now we might say, well, utilitarianism, which is about consequences, consequentialism. Something is good if it brings about good consequences. Okay, and the good consequences is that people are not being harmed. Yeah, so you could make that argument, but the problem you've got there is that once you accept that moral viewpoint, it opens you up to morally accepting that we could harm a small amount of people if it gives greater benefits to a larger number of people. What? And so it puts us in this, I don't know what to do. And this is one of our problems as an industry. We're trying, some people are really trying to sort of figure this ethics thing out, but they're not ethicists. And they're struggling to do it. there are ways of overcoming it. There are ways of thinking it through. There are tools we can use, but we have to know what the tools are, and we have to be able to think them through.
Yeah.
Am I making any sense here?
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very thought-provoking, that's for sure.
So let's look at our second one now.
Yeah.
So remember, my attitude here is, can I save the argument of zero harm? What can I do to save it? My starting point is, right, poke a finger at it and make it sound rubbish. I'm trying to save it, okay? Because that's what we do. That's what we're trying to do. Rather than just reject things, we're looking for the best version of it.
Yeah.
So my next question is, well, okay then. Yeah, we recognise there are issues with the concepts of harm, but you know, do people not have a right never to be harmed in the workplace? And if so, what does that mean? So,
and that's very topical, isn't it? Because that's something that recently has been proclaimed as a right.
It has, yes. Which is one of the reasons probably why I put it in there, you know, because there has been a big hoo-ha and all that lot. So can I ask you a question?
Yep.
So the ILO's statement, you know, that safe and healthy working environments and methods of work is a fundamental human right. What does that mean?
So I would say a right is something to which we are legally entitled.
Okay.
I don't know. That's the definition that I would.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Now that is definitely one form of rights, legal.
Yeah.
So one of the things that not so sure anybody actually said is that what none of the the bodies that were talking about it and people who commented about it, nobody actually said, to my knowledge, that actually what the ILO have passed has no impact at all on health and safety in many countries. None at all. Let's take the UK for example. Well, what does it say? What did the ILO statement say? It says that countries that are members, I think there's 187 of them, what they have to do is they have a duty, so far as is reasonably practicable, to manage or to organise health and safety. Overly simple. There's a lot more to it than that. But so far as reasonably practicably. Okay. So that's not an absolute right, is it?
No.
No, that's not an absolute right. And in the UK, most of our legislation is underpinned with that caveat, isn't it? Well, you know, keep people safe, but so far as is reasonably practicable. Yeah? Oh, okay. Have you ever been told that in any of these statements about it, that it makes no difference to UK health and safety?
No, because it's presented as if it's a right in the same way as, what are the rights we got? The right to vote, or the right to bear arms in America. You know, under the Constitution, there's a legal right to bear arms. You know, and obviously there are certain legal frameworks that prohibit that for certain people, but broadly speaking, it applies to everybody and no questions asked.
Okay. So, well, first of all, I just want to stress, I am not saying that it's not an important thing. I am not saying that. There are goodness knows how many people in the world are having terrible, unbearable working environments.
Yeah.
And if what the ILO have brought into play can help those people, and they don't just come out with statements, they actually do invest and try and support countries as well. So they are, they're not just sort of like saying things without actually putting anything into practice. But I do think it's important for us to actually recognise what that means. It's a legal right.
Yeah.
So it goes like this. And legal rights are really interesting. And I explain this to people. Like yesterday, I was working with some financial advisors, and I was showing them how rights and obligations fit in. Okay, and it works like this. The ILO, have authority to give obligations to countries. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, governments in countries have the rights, to give obligations to businesses and to employees. Okay. Legal rights to do that by, if we take I know there's so many different types of countries and different ways of doing it, but if we focus on the UK, the UK government have a legal right to talk about things, pass laws, and then we all have to do it, don't we? Yeah, follow the law. It's the same.
Or Parliament in if we're going to get really specific, because the government can't decide; it has to be voted through by Parliament. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, thank you for that. So Parliament, they all put their hand up and say, yes, we think that's a good idea, or no, we don't. And I know we have the House of Lords and all that lot.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is they have the power. They have what's called a power right.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of a thing called the Hofeldian rights analysis system?
No.
Okay. So maybe we'll do a chat on that one day. But the idea of rights can be traced back whether somebody has a power right or somebody is immune from a right, can be traced back to this Hofeldian analytic version of rights, analysis of rights. Okay, so let's go back to it then. So the government, they say, right, okay, if you're in the UK and you're a business, you have an obligation to work according to this law. Okay. But what they also do as well is with businesses, they give businesses the power, they have a power right to give their employees obligations. Yeah. But also running alongside of that, employees are given obligations from the government. So the government give the business rights and obligations. Okay. But the government also gives individual workers obligations. And they have the power to do that. Are you following me?
Yeah.
Okay. This is relevant to this argument on rights. Okay. So let's go back to the ILO thing. So the ILO thing is only a legal right. That's all it is, which in the UK is something we've got kind of sorted out already. So we might think that we might ask ourselves, is what the ILO is what they've stated, is that something which is saying that we should have a right to zero harm? So based on that, really overly brief and hopefully it was easy to understand explanation there, could we argue that we have a legal right to zero harm based on that, like I say, that mini little chat we had there?
Well, I would say no, because the law has the caveat of as far as reasonably practicable.
Oh, okay then. Right. So for there any argument to say, if anyone wanted to argue, and people have, and I've got quotes in here which I won't read out, of saying that people have a right never to be harmed in the workplace, it would appear that they're talking about moral rights.
Yeah.
Because we can reject a legal right to it, can't we? So there must be a moral right. Okay, so now we have to ask ourselves, where does that moral right come from? Does it come from my duty to look after you? If I have a duty to look after you, does that give you a right to be looked after? Or does your right to be looked after give me obligations according to your right? Where does it start from? Where's the locus of rights, of moral rights? We're not going to be able to answer this question today, but it's a question that we considered. Okay. So let's look at this now. So the notion of, if there is a right, who is the rights holder? So is that you, if you're the worker and you're the person who could be, be injured, Okay. Is it you who has the right? And if it's you who has the right, does that mean that you also have the right to go, I don't want that right? Yeah, I've actually got the right. I've got immunity from, I can give you immunity from an obligation to uphold my right.
Hmm. Yeah, like if you were a cage fighter, let's say,
Yeah.
and that was your chosen career, and you're going to work fighting someone else in a cage, well, it's impossible to to to, to have a right of not to be harmed if you're doing that as your job.
Yeah.
So
So I,
therefore, you'd have
so
the
I,
right to
yeah.
forego that.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're working through this, and it's fascinating, Christian. Once you start delving
Mm.
into this, your brain goes, "Brah!"
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, mine does anyway. Oh my goodness, what does that mean? Okay, so let's try and keep on track here now. Let's try and think about this now. Okay, so we've got these safety people who were saying everyone has a right never to be harmed in the workplace. Okay, so that's our starting point. Well, we've said, well, that legal right will only take us so far. So to fill in that gap between where the legal right ends into never being harmed, we've got that moral right that we've got to now try and consider, haven't we? There are definitely problems about who is the rights holder, and does a right originate from you as the rights holder, or me as the do I have a right to ensure that you are never harmed in the workplace? Have
Mm.
I got a right to do that? So there's two different theories that we need to think about. Well, there's more than two, but the main ones are this: is the will theory. The will theory is first. Now, the will theory is this: it says that you are the rights holder. You're the worker here, and I don't know what I am. I'm the safety person or the business, whatever I am.
Yeah.
So the will theory of rights say that you are the rights holder. Okay. And you can decide whether you choose to you give obligations to me in respect of your rights. Okay. So you get to choose if you're the rights holder under
Hmm.
will theory. But that's really interesting, because if that's the argument we're making for a moral right, that means you have a right to say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to wear my PPE. I'm not doing it. Now, that's not going to sit well, is it?
No. And rights is about freedoms as well, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes. So if you're the rights holder, well, you have a right to say, oh, I don't want that right. Thank you very much. So, well, there's quite a bit in here about arguing how that just won't work. Okay, so now we say, well, okay, well, there's another common theory of rights, and that's called the interest theory. And the idea of the interest theory of rights says, well, I have a right to give you obligations because it's in your best interest. Okay. So the idea is I can override your right to autonomy, okay, and self-direction, because I believe there is something, you're not able to decide for yourself about what's right or wrong for you. So I'm going to give you an obligation because it's in your interest. Okay. That's another way. And they're the two most common arguments for rights. Once we've gone past legal rights, remember, we're now
Yeah.
talking about moral
Yeah.
rights, different
Yeah.
thing. Okay. Now, this is absolutely fascinating, because what it means is it means that the safety person is in a position to tell the worker what's good for them. Where did that authority come from? I'm not sure where that came from.
And
Okay.
that's going right back to where we started, isn't it? Of how do we feel we have the moral imperative to tell the society or businesses or people what to do?
But let's just caveat this. We are not talking about legal rights. We're not talking about, people having a right to choose whether they work. There's a roof over there with some scaffolding. I just want to walk on there in my plimsolls. I don't need scaffolding. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the gap between severe detrimental effects and all effects, that gap in between. Yeah. This is the bit we're interested in here. We are not rejecting. I am in no way rejecting, that you could do what you want. And yeah, I'm not saying that.
No.
I'm not saying it's acceptable to allow people to be harmed and not to manage severe risk. I am not saying that at all. What I'm saying is I'm talking about that gap. And that gap is a moral gap. The whole gap is moral and legal, but it's just that small bit. And this is the bit we're talking about. And this is the bit where zero harm resides. This is the bit where no one should ever be harmed in the workplace. This is where it fits in there.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit into everything. It just fits in this bit because we've accepted that argument already. That seems like prima facie, just common sense, mate. I'm not even going anywhere near discussing that. So where we are so far is really interesting. Now this brings us to a different position. So now we've got to say, well, and I've oversimplified it, obviously. Right, well, we've got ourselves in this position now where we're arguing for something, and we think that no one should ever be harmed in the workplace. We genuinely believe it, but we can't find an argument for it. We can't at the moment, other than just saying, well, I just do it, right? But that's not what professionals do. Just do as I say, I know best. That's just not going to cut it, is it, really? So can you see how I rejected the notion of a moral right to zero harm? And again, there's a lot more to it than what I've done. And you seem to be following really well. So either you're really good, or you managed to make sense of my babbling, or
you're doing a good job explaining it, I think.
I hope so. Right. Okay. Well, how exciting is this? I mean, even if we just stop there, there's so many different things you go out and look at differently now, aren't they? There are, aren't they?
Yeah, because it's bringing in this questioning and this reasoning approach, which because there are so many things that you just kind of take as read, particularly in this space. You just accept it that that's the way it is, but then you're not really thinking, well, why and what does that mean and what are the implications? And yeah, it's very very interesting.
It is. So we're actually moving into. I mean, obviously, ethics is it's a philosophical concept. Far too often we have psychologists telling us about ethics. They're not ethicists, they're psychologists. Or we have sociologists telling us about ethics. They're not ethicists, they're sociologists. And you need a degree of basic understanding to posit some of these, to think about some of these questions. And that's why I think a minimum standard of ethical literacy for certain levels of professionalism gives people the opportunity to have a discussion. If we don't know what a right is, and we don't have the tools to be able to consider, well, what do we mean by harm? Never really. It just becomes my opinion against yours. The Reds are better than the Blues, or sausages are better than cheese, but we're above that. We're professionals. We should be. And this is what I think. This is, hopefully it's coming across that way. So, right now it's up to you. Do you want to move on to talk about something else, or have you sort of had enough?
I'm just thinking, Simon. I suppose I'm thinking we've done about an hour. And we've covered these first 2 points. I'm wondering if we should maybe park the discussion there and then pick it up for another episode, and run through the going on from here into, therefore, is there a fiduciary duty of care around zero harm, and do we have a duty to adopt zero harm, and kind of conclude conclude things there, and then maybe we can talk a bit more about some of these other ethical questions. Does that sound good to you? Because I'm conscious we've
It's probably I don't know. I'm not sure if it is the most important thing to consider, but is whether we have a professional duty,
yeah
not zero harm.
yeah
I'm going to leave you with a question for next time
okay
to think about.
go
Okay.
on.
Sometimes people say that zero harm is an aspiration. We have an aspiration to zero
Yeah.
harm. Okay. So one of the questions, I'm going to leave you with this question. Well, two questions. First of all, what is an aspiration?
Hmm.
And secondly, do aspirations create obligations for us to work towards the aspiration? So if we say we have an aspiration to X, are we obligated to work according to X?
Yeah, that's yeah. You want me to answer?
I want you to answer, and if
Okay.
you want, and
Um,
that's the only point, let's throw one in. What's the difference between an aspiration and a wish?
yeah. So, and again, this is a bit of semantics, isn't it? Here, so I would say um, there's a difference between a goal and an aspiration, and a wish. And to me, an aspiration is not quite the same as a goal. Where I think a goal is something measurable and manageable, and therefore you could sort of create the building blocks to get to it, and therefore you probably feel there is an obligation to work towards it. Whereas an aspiration to me is slightly fluffier. Maybe I'm wrong, but slightly fluffier, less concrete, less clear, and therefore I wouldn't say there's necessarily an obligation to do it, but it's something that might be good to do, rather than it's a specific goal we've set and we're going to work towards it.
Okay, so brilliant. I like that. I mean, you were dropped in it there, weren't you, Christian? You know, I mean, and you did really well. So that's brilliant. I like your reasoning. So let's think about that then. So if we agree with what you've said, okay, is it worth the paper it's written on if I say we have an aspiration for zero harm?
Well, I suppose it isn't in the sense of will anything concrete come of it, and I guess there's things there's analogies you can draw here to other things in safety, but is there an argument perhaps to say that um, there was a football manager, I think it was maybe Bob Paisley, who said, if you aim to the stars, you might get to the ceiling, whereas if you aim to the ceiling, you won't get off the ground, or the quote was something like that. In other words, if you can use something as a bit of a rallying call that inspires people and gets them moving in the right direction, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get to the stars using his analogy. But if it means you get off the ground and start moving forward, then perhaps there is a value there, even though it's not as concrete. I don't know.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying, and I think you made a great argument there. But the interesting thing is then, if it just becomes a rhetorical statement,
It's
that
meaningless.
that doesn't create any obligations.
Yeah,
Right, I think everyone here should be a millionaire. Honestly, we should aspire to it. Yeah,
yeah.
okay, what are you going to do about it? Nothing. Oh, okay. Maybe that doesn't work as an analogy.
Mm.
You see the point I'm saying?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And I think as professionals, we should be actually considering questions such as that because there's
Mm.
people out there who are listening to us and going, "Well, what do you think? You're the professional."
Yeah.
So rhetoric is all very well and good, but it might not be helpful from a professional perspective. Uh,
Mm.
you know. So anyway,
Yeah.
I know you've got stuff to do.
Lots to chew on.
Lots to chew on, yeah. And I don't know when the
Lots to
next
chew
one.
on.
Do you know what I'd really like to do, Christian, somewhere down the line? And I don't know if this is something you would want to do, or I have no idea if anybody would want to do it. I think it'd be really nice to have these questions and have a group of people figuring them
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
So, well, what do you think? And
Yeah. No,
you
I
know,
think that would be really interesting. And that's the sort of thing you need to. to get a room somewhere and actually have people in face to face and kind of really
yeah,
hash these things out. So here's something then. So we'll put this out to the audience. Is that something you'd be keen to get involved in? Because it's something that we could facilitate, Simon. Something that we could probably get, uh, you know, industry bodies or other third parties that are interested to get involved in and maybe provide a room for us and some sandwiches or something. Yeah, that would be an interesting thing to do. So let's throw it out there and see if people are keen.
yeah, yeah. And I would love to help with that. So just to confirm, if we did that, my role isn't telling people what to think.
No,
My
no,
role is just like saying, "Whoa, well, Christian
yeah,
said this. What do you think?"
facilitating a discussion. Yeah, just like I do on the safety roundtable, which I know you've been to once or twice. It's throwing an idea out there and saying, well, what do we think, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that would be good. Um, well, look, thank you very much, Simon. I've really enjoyed today. It's made me think a lot. But what's the best? What have you got to plug? What's the best way for people to get in touch? Where can people learn more? All of that kind of stuff.
Christian, this is a completely rubbish business perspective. Okay, is I wanted to talk about this for a few years before having anything to sell.
Yeah.
And because I'm not doing this to sell something.
No.
That's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because I genuinely think we need to be better. And I'm
Yeah.
not I don't get up in the morning and go and volunteer. I go to work, earn a living, I charge people for things. But this thing, I made a conscious decision not to commercialize it. But I am going to
Yeah.
in the future. I'm going to write a book
Yeah.
about it. And, but to start off with, I didn't want that to taint it.
Yeah.
Which I felt that it would have tainted it. But I'm not saying I'm a good person or whatever. I just want us to talk about ethics and let's
Yeah.
forget the other stuff for now.
Are there any good thought leaders or resources or groups or websites or stuff that if this conversation has gripped somebody, they could go away, obviously follow you on LinkedIn and get involved with what you're doing, but are there any other things you'd recommend?
Well, there's obviously loads of books, but there's somebody who I mean, there's obviously lots of really smart people out there who are doing great things, but if there's one who I think is a great starting point, is a person called Michael J. Sandel.
Okay.
And he's written, I've got loads of his books over here, see what we can find. Getting you over here, Michael J. Sandel. So he's written books like, they're around here somewhere, I'll probably link them to someone. Things like Justice.
Right.
What Money Can't Buy. And Michael J. Sandel is the real deal. He's a philosophy professor, an ethics professor at Harvard University, but he's got a beautiful way of explaining it so people like me who are not as bright as him can understand him. He's just brilliant. So yeah, Justice, What Money Can't Buy. There's about 4 or 5 of them. I've got them around here.
Okay. Yeah.
They're really good for getting to these kind of core subjects. Ooh,
Yeah.
what does that mean? Yeah, and what is often the case is that people can find it as a really good sort of starting grounding point for developing concepts, their understanding of things like, well, what does fair mean? What does honest mean? What is this? Some things that actually we shouldn't be able to buy, and if so, why? But he does it in such a really cool way, and he has
Nice. Yeah.
on the Harvard website they have like lectures and stuff, and it's all free. I mean, you have to pay.
Nice. Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, go with him. If anyone's thinking, oh, I don't know what I want for Christmas, start with something from him because he's the real deal. So
Right.
yeah, so brilliant.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Great recommendation. Well, look, thanks very much, Simon. Fascinating stuff. Let's keep the conversation going, and then let's arrange another one soon, and we can carry on delving into this because I just think it's profoundly interesting, and it affects not just safety, but it affects a lot of the way you think about all sorts of things in life. So to me, that's always a conversation worth having.
Thank you very much, Christian. Have a great Christmas, you and the family and everything, and
Yeah, you too. Yeah,
go safe. Yeah, keep wish you all the best, pal.
good
See you
stuff.
soon.
Cheers, Simon.
See
Thanks.
you later. Bye.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.